Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Immigration and the American Identity, edited by Thomas Fleming. This book's not really presented as edited by Thomas Fleming. It's really just presented as selections from Chronicles magazine, but it's clear from looking at it that it's really Thomas Fleming is the editor-in-chief, I guess, of Chronicles magazine at the time that this is published, and I can only imagine that he was the one who made the decisions of what essays would be in here. And this is a really cool book. It was published back in 1995, which was a good year, by the way. And it contains essays from Chronicles magazine from 1985 to 1995, dealing with the topic of immigration primarily. Chronicles magazine is a great magazine. I recommend you pick up a copy of it. Check it out online. There is a print copy that you can get as well. And a lot of bookstores carry it. I was surprised that my local mega bookstore has Chronicles magazine on the shelf, which is a great investment to pick up the latest issue. It's been out for a long time, obviously, since 1985, and I don't know when Chronicles magazine started, but at the very least, they've been publishing since 85. And it's like the flagship magazine for the paleocons, for the paleoconservatives. Last episode, we talked a little bit about Chronicles magazine. It did come up in that book by Paul Gottfried. Paul Gottfried actually is involved in Chronicles magazine. He has an essay here in this book. And there were a lot of good essays in here I wanted to address, but I'm going to narrow it down. I'm not going to make this a 2-episode series. I'm just going to narrow it down to a few of the most important points that I think need to get addressed. But if you can get your hands on a copy of this book, I recommend you do so, just to see how some of the conversations about immigration that we're having today have been important issues for a long time and have been really thoroughly neglected by politicians throughout the West. Particularly, this particularly pertains to America. But throughout the West, there have been immigration issues for many years. And in America, I think probably a little earlier than Europe, although Europe is really going through it. The U.S. had pretty significant immigration going back way back into its history, but of course it just seems to be overwhelming lately. Now this is some time ago, so the immigration problem has only gotten worse from the time when this book was published. The levels of immigration have gone up. And they were not. The immigration was not a minor issue back then either, as you'll see in some of the sections that I'm going to read. And it's remarkable how little has been done to address these issues by conservatives, especially. You would think that conservatives would at least be attempting to fix some of these problems, but no, not really. Conservatives have done very little to fix these problems. Until recently, that is. It's finally gotten to a point where immigration is so bad and has become such a major part of the public conversation that there's no way around it. And of course also the rise of Donald Trump. He has made immigration a major part of his campaign and of his presidency, so it's really come to the fore finally, but it's not a new issue. It's not like this is an issue that just arose. It's an issue that's been around for a long time, and conservatives and Republicans have just neglected dealing with it to all of our great detriment. So, like all my episodes, I'll read a couple sections here and provide a little bit of feedback, a little bit of commentary maybe about some of the things that these authors are saying. Several essays in here that I want to talk about. The first one is an essay called Unseer Loot. I think that's how you pronounce this. It's not an English phrase. It's a German phrase. The author is Jean Bethke Elshtain. And this is a pretty good essay. It's pretty interesting. She talks about her grandmother a lot in here. And I'm not going to read the sections where she's talking about her grandmother, although that is really interesting and kind of moving. I want to just read one section where she talks about home. The concept of home, what a home is, are important to conservatism. I think when we talk about tradition and we talk about nationhood and the various things that we talk about in the importance of the family, the idea of home and what a home is are something that we really should maybe give a little more thought to. And it is an important aspect of the immigration debate when we consider that our nation is our home. We're not global citizens. The world is not our home. The nation is our home. And it's a distinct place that is ours, not the same as someone else's. And that particularity of why this place is our home is important, and something that she sort of addresses here. So that's what I want to read from this essay. So here she says, quote, there must be something natural about the way in which human beings have, in every culture, every place, every time, set about creating homes for themselves, protected spaces, within which the shape of their face-to-face relations could be structured and given form and texture. In Mary Midgley's words, the notion of being at home is actually a rather modest idea. It does not mean having an environment that has been especially designed for you. It means having one where you belong. And human beings cannot belong just any place, for human beings start out their lives as helpless, dependent creatures who need protected spaces and places in order to grow up at all. The original image of the abandoned child is of a child exposed, left on a hillside to starve, to perish from the elements, to be eaten by wild animals. A child without a home, homelessness, exposure, abandonment. The powerful themes and images cluster together. That they do so speaks to something very primitive, very deep. It goes to the core of what it means to be a human person and to have a human culture. Home is specific. Homes speak to and of our need for roots. Uprootedness, like homelessness, signifies the death of the spirit, the travail of the body, the curse of history. We require the rootedness that the form and idea of home provides, in order to grow up with a sense of ourselves as particular, unique, and worthy beings, and ideally to see others as our fellows, not enemies, not foes, not that which stands in our way and must be destroyed. For the bitterly homeless are disruptive. They would destroy that which they can feel only as an absence, a negation of self. We know that it is only through the child's special relationships to specific others, the family, in the home, that he or she can later identify with and reach out to others, and house a wider universe, familiarize a social space that stretches beyond the walls and doors and windows of this house, this home, these particular people. The home is a work of culture. It is culture, one of the forms within which culture itself takes shape. How does this work? The home is a particular and specific place, an incubating chamber, a launching pad, at times a prison, but it is necessary. As necessary to the creation of a human life, to the possibility of intimacy, as life lived rather than longed for, as the air we breathe. Some people are very unlucky in their homes. Some homes are battlegrounds rather than nurturing spaces. But this is the human condition, to be struggled against in its particular abuses, but no more to be lamented than the fact that the sun fails to shine 24 hours a day. End quote. So, not too long of a section there, but what do we see? Basically, the idea that having a home is natural. It's a natural phenomena, and it's just hardwired in us that we expect, we want a home. We're born as vulnerable babies, and we need protected spaces. We need safe spaces, so to speak, when we're babies and when we're children. We need to be not abandoned. So there's a sort of contrast she draws here between homelessness and having a home, and homelessness she connects to the abandoned child. And she says that clustered together are the notions of homelessness, exposure, and abandonment. And she says it speaks to something very primitive, what it means to be a human and what it means to have a human culture. Because everywhere all over the world, people build homes for themselves and they separate themselves from their neighbors. Not total separation, but there's a connection amongst people in a home, an intimacy amongst people in a home that's not shared with everyone else. It's a more intimate space. There's something different about the way that you interact with the people that are in your home, that are in your family, that you live with. There's just a greater level of intimacy. There's a greater connection there. And that sort of setting aside of a place for a people who are connected with one another and who share something with one another that is not shared with just the general population, that's kind of particularization, that isolation from other people and creation of a space of nurturing for children, of connection, of familial ties. These are all very natural phenomena that humans experience. So, I mean, I guess that's kind of obvious, but it's important to take note of. And it's also important to take note of where she says that homes speak to and of our need for roots. So this root, the idea of being rooted, and the idea of being uprooted. Being uprooted, being rootless, is like being homeless. And we require the rootedness of that the form and the idea of home provide. So rootedness meaning connected, that we're bound in some way to some place. Like, you know, people move all the time. They move across country. They move from one town to another. I've certainly moved before from one place to another. But there's something to be said for being bound to a place over multiple generations. Your fate becomes bound up with the fate of the community, and you are a member of the community in a way that's more profound than if you just move into town and, you know, you live here. Like, you might live in a town, but perhaps you just move there, and perhaps you probably wouldn't, if you just moved to a town recently and you don't really know a lot of people in this town, you probably don't feel the same sort of connection to the town, to all of the locations in the town. You don't have, you don't pass by a certain location and have a whole slew of memories and connections with that location that spring forth at every corner and every building and every nook and cranny of the town. You're not connected to the town in that way. The town itself doesn't weave its way through your memory. So having like a long-term connection with a place builds something different that's not that's not granted just by the fact that I live in a house in this town. I live in this town, but to live in a town that you just moved to recently is certainly not the same as having grown up in a town, living in a town, having your parents have had grown up in the town, being in the house perhaps that you lived in when you were a child, being able to visit the house that you lived in when you were a child. That's a different sort of connection to a community than just showing up and letting the post office know that you live here now. It's the difference between having roots and not having roots. And that's the sort of thing that is expanded into the notion of nationhood. Nationhood really just as an extension of the family, an extension of the home. So let me move on to where the essays really begin to start talking more about immigration specifically. There's a section here by Wayne Lutton in an essay called The Silent Invasion, where this essay, by the way, is from 1987, so one of the earlier essays, and he's talking about the immigration situation at that time. So you're talking almost 40 years ago. This is certainly not a new phenomena by any stretch. And so here he says, quote, "In 1986, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, apprehended 1.8 million illegal aliens along our southern border, less than half the number who tried to enter. This was in addition to approximately 500,000 legal immigrants, a number greater than the number of immigrants accepted by the other 150-odd nations combined. That fall, the Simpson-Rodino Immigration Reform Act passed into law. While it does attempt to discourage illegal immigration by providing penalties for employers who knowingly hire illegal aliens, the law also grants amnesty for aliens who can document that they have resided in our country since before January 1st, 1982. Given the easy availability of forged records and the generous attitude of volunteer organizations enlisted by the federal government to assist with amnesty processing, some of which have a record of sympathy with the sanctuary movement, the public's demand for immigration control may have been subverted by the very legislation that had been enacted to cope with the problem. Indeed, after a brief slowdown in border apprehensions from late fall through early February of 1987, it is now clear that aliens are still coming in larger and larger numbers. Though the United States is a part of the Western world, only 5% of the legal immigrants in 1986 came from Europe. The rest of the legal immigrants and the overwhelming percentage of the illegals came from the Third World. Many are from Mexico and Central America, but other people from India, China, the Middle East, and Africa are using Mexico as a trampoline to enter the United States. The San Diego Border Patrol Office intercepted illegal aliens from 67 countries along its sector in 1986. The experience is also true for stations in Texas. In Florida, in addition to increasing numbers of Cubans, Colombians, and Haitians, Sikhs and Bangladeshi have been among the foreign nationals caught trying to enter. 20 years ago, General Leonard Chapman, then commissioner of the INS, warned, "Illegal immigration is out of control." More recently, President Ronald Reagan testified that this country has lost control of its own borders, and no country can sustain that kind of position. Yet massive immigration continues, and may be surpassing the all-time highs recorded at the turn of the 20th century. Nor has there been much public attention given to the question of how large-scale immigration will affect the future of the United States. As sociologists Glaister and Evelyn Elmer of Indiana University note, it is highly debatable whether a population diversity unprecedented in a democratic country will lead to the great and tranquil society we all desire, or to divisiveness and eventual disintegration. Eric Severeid, the veteran CBS newsman and one of the first journalists labeled a neoconservative, expressed his concern for the future of our country. In an interview with the Christian Science Monitor, January 28, 1987, he remarked that one of the truly major issues that must be dealt with is what he calls the vast tidal wave of human beings moving from the Third World into the Western nations. There is a fragmentation going on in this country, he observes. At what point, he asks, does cultural, racial diversity become a kind of social anarchy? How do you get national cohesion this way? It has been said that Americans would rather live with comfortable myths than confront inconvenient realities. John F. Kennedy's pedestrian observation that we are a nation of immigrants, what nation isn't, is used by many as an excuse for failing to come to grips with the problems associated with the great influx of peoples we are experiencing today. The economic, social, public health, political, and national security dangers inherent in allowing immigration without limit to continue are real. We can no longer afford the luxury of pretending that they simply do not exist. According to the latest figures from the Labor Department, over 7 million Americans are currently unemployed. but this figure does not include those who are underemployed or those who have simply given up looking for work. During a time of sustained high and underemployment, the United States has been importing record numbers of foreign workers, both legal and illegal. Immigrants have been admitted without efforts to determine their labor market impact. Vernon Briggs of Cornell University finds that only 5% of legal immigrants have come here because they possess skills that are in short supply in the United States, or because they are especially distinguished in their fields. It has often been noted that if aliens were displacing lawyers, bureaucrats, professors, and media personalities, swift action would be taken to halt the flood. But those most directly affected by aliens in the labor force are not people who make their living by verbal ability. There are two common mistakes made about alien workers. First, that they are mostly engaged in seasonal agricultural labor, and second, that they generally take jobs that American citizens will not perform. In fact, relatively few foreign workers are farmhands or dishwashers. Only 15% of employed aliens work in agriculture. Most work in cities, in heavy and light industry, construction, and the service sectors. Donald Huddle of Rice University has found that for every 100 aliens employed in a given employment sector, at least 65 Americans are displaced or remain unemployed. Among those most directly affected by alien job seekers are members of our minority populations, teenagers, and part-time workers. It is increasingly difficult for entry-level applicants in parts of California, Texas, and Florida to find any employment without being able to speak a version of Spanish or some Asian dialect. Do we not have a prior responsibility to our homegrown entry and marginally employable before we admit more unskilled workers? It is all the more important to address the condition of our hard-pressed citizens, as it seems likely that technology will eliminate a large portion of the relatively simple jobs in the service, office, and manufacturing areas. As Bruce Nussbaum commented in his book The World After Oil, the last thing America is going to need in the years ahead is a flood of unskilled labor. As techno-casualties mount, a growing number of de-skilled people will be moving into the unskilled labor pool. Hence, a growing number of people, many of them furious at their new lower status in life, will be competing for a shrinking number of jobs. End quote. So, none of that should sound particularly unfamiliar. This is the same exact argument that we're having today, almost 40 years later. It's remarkable to me that this stuff was being spoken about, being written about decades ago, and nothing happened. So there's a few things in here that are interesting. One of them is, so he does say, he quotes Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan talking about how the country has lost control of its borders. No country can sustain that kind of position. And yet, Ronald Reagan signed off on the amnesty that he talks about from, 1986? The Simpson-Rodino Immigration Reform Act, which provided amnesty for aliens who can document that they'd been in the country for a whopping 4 years. If an illegal alien had been in the country for 4 years, if they could demonstrate, if they could prove that they'd been here for a whole 4 years, they were given amnesty. Now, part of that, if I understand this correctly, and it doesn't talk in detail about that act, but I believe there was a sort of compromise where the amnesty would be granted to the people who were already here, and security at the border would be increased to prevent future people from arriving. It was almost as if, all right, well, we're going to shut the door to new people, and then the people that are already here, we're going to go ahead and give them amnesty. So the amnesty was granted, but the border never closed. None of the immigration restriction that was supposed to be paired with the amnesty actually happened. So this was legislation that was supposed to cope with the problem, only made the problem worse. And of course, when people are given amnesty who had come illegally, that's a magnet. They say people in other countries say, well, they did it once. They forgave everybody who had come in illegally and gave them amnesty. They'll do it again. We just got to show up again. There will be a new conflict, a new argument in Congress, and they'll ultimately pass another amnesty bill down the road. And of course, ever since then, there have been rumblings of pathways to citizenship and things of that nature. So, kind of a disappointment from Reagan. He recited the right phrase, but legislatively, he didn't really do anything to actually stop the immigration problem, the illegal immigration that was flowing across the border. He also, interestingly, talks about this guy, Eric Severid, who was apparently a neoconservative, one of the first journalists labeled a neoconservative, who's bringing up the issue at the border. So I don't think it's the case that every single neoconservative is 100% on board with this border invasion. I think that would be a drastic over-exaggeration. Neoconservatives tend not to be quite as concerned with this as the paleoconservatives, but nevertheless, the neoconservatives, at least some of them, recognize the problem. But yeah, he talks about how many people are unemployed and underemployed and have left the workforce. And with all these people out of work, why are we bringing in all of these new people to, who are going to be looking for jobs, they're going to be competing in the job market? And he says, then you consider the automation that, again, nearly 40 years ago, people were talking about automation, that certain jobs would become obsolete and would be mechanized, and a dwindling number of unskilled jobs being sought after by a larger and larger number of people that had been previously employed, and then their job kind of vanished as technology moved on, and they're re-entering the workforce looking for employment, and their skill set is no longer relevant. They're bitter and angry, and now they have to compete for dwindling number of jobs with an increasing number of people. The whole situation just seems absurd, and it was absurd back then, and it remains absurd today. And I just wanted to read that section to point out how long people have been talking about this and yet accomplishing absolutely nothing. It's everything he describes in here is still going on today to a greater extent. It's worse now than it was then, and it's just remarkable to me that it's taken Donald Trump, a total outsider, to come in and fix this problem, because the elected Republicans had done nothing. The presidents that we've had, the Republican presidents that we've had over the last 40 years, up to and including Ronald Reagan, have done nothing. They've done nothing to fix this. The most they've done is complain. So anyway, let's move to the next section. There's a few things that are talked about in this book that I think are interesting, because they're arguments that are often more likely to be found on the left. But there's a bit of a horseshoe effect going on here, where the paleocons tend to be a little bit more open to discussions of environmental degradation, and more open to discussions of population. Now, obviously, we have an issue, and there was an issue back then, and it is brought up at times in this book, although I think the problem is more severe, about birth rates. And but that's only a portion of the question, because there was at that time, and there still is, growing global population. And so global overpopulation was a real big issue. back then, and it's become less of an issue now because, well, less of an issue particularly on the right because there's so many people that are concerned about birth rates and our declining birth rates and the declining birth rates in Europe and throughout the developed world. In some cases, the birth rates are like tragically low, apocalyptically low, like in South Korea or some places in Europe where the birth rates are just abysmal and they're not high enough to sustain the population. And so the solution is to bring in more immigrants. And so with this like birth rate problem that we're dealing with, nobody really wants to talk about overpopulation. And then there's of course the Elon Musk technocratic approach, and Elon Musk is really about this idea that any talk of overpopulation is like, going to lead down the avenue to population control, and population control is going to, discussing population control is really, only a veiled way of talking about mass genocide, things like that. That the, Elon Musk kind of presents it in an almost cartoonish fashion, where like, we're facing this sort of extinction of humanity, that the enemies of massively expanding population are just extinctionists, that there's the humanists versus the extinctionists, and any conversation about overpopulation is really, leading toward a conversation about deliberately engineered human extinction. And that's kind of nonsense, right? I mean, we can all recognize that that's nonsense. Humans aren't going extinct. Our national population is as high as it's ever been. The global population is as high as it's ever been. Humans are not going extinct. The real issue is one that Elon Musk, it's not that he's afraid of, but he doesn't really address quite correctly, because the birth rates in Africa are not collapsing. They're beginning to slow, but they're still pretty high. The birth rates of Central America, South America, the birth rates of the Middle East, the birth rates of the Islamic population, the birth rates of immigrants in the Western world are all still pretty high. So the real issue isn't just global population. The issue isn't human extinction. The issue is very specifically white, European, Western people who are not reproducing. The birth rate issue is our issue. It is a Western issue. It is not a global issue. And so we may, as Westerners, and more specifically as white Westerners, have a problem with our birth rates and with our population. And so we don't really want to have to get hammered with, oh, don't have any more kids, they're bad for the environment. Don't have any more kids, there's too many people. You need to like tone down your productive capacity, your childbearing capacity. You should have only one kid or no kids, or if you have kids, you're destroying the planet. We're not the real target for that argument. We shouldn't be the target for that argument, because we're not even at replacement level birth rates. It's the rest of the world. It's the third world that needs to hear that argument. It's the third world that is reproducing like rabbits, not us, not the Westerners. So there are two problems simultaneous, and they're opposing one another. And we shouldn't just lean on one or lean on the other as like the big problem. Both problems, the collapsing birth rates of the Western world, the collapsing birth rates of the developed world, and the remarkably high birth rates of the rest of the world, the high birth rates of the third world, and the exploding population of planet Earth. Those are two problems, and they interact with one another in such a way that creates an immigration crisis. These third world countries with ballooning populations have excess population, and they do well to kind of push off the excess people. They don't want to have population that's getting higher and higher and higher and higher, and they're clustered into these small nations. They do well to sort of push off their excess population. And then on the other hand, you've got the politicians and the great thinkers of the Western world who are welcoming all of the excess population from the other parts of the world, from the third world, in to compensate for the fact that we aren't procreating. So there's two problems, and we only ever talk on the right about the birth rate problem. But the concept of global overpopulation is part of the problem that's driving the immigration crisis, because there are so many people in the other parts of the world who are short on space, short on resources, and they want to come to the West to occupy the spaces that we no longer seem able to occupy ourselves. And so this book talks about, is a little bit more comfortable. I guess my point is this book is a little bit more comfortable talking about overpopulation, talking about environmental issues as well, and how these issues tie into the immigration crisis. And I like that. These are components of this question that should be addressed honestly and clearly. And so when this essay is called Promises to Keep, and it is by Chilton Williamson Jr. And this essay talks a bit about the environment and how it affects immigration, and I can appreciate that. He says, quote, "It is considered humanitarian to fret about population growth and its effects on the natural environment at the global, which is to say at the abstract level, but racist, xenophobic, uncompassionate, and un-American to worry about the population crisis as it immediately affects the United States, the only place in the world where we are in a position to be able to do anything about it. A few years ago, the late Edward Abbey agreed to write an article on the subject of immigration, legal and otherwise, for the New York Times op-ed page, at the invitation of its editor. The editor held the piece for 2 months before requesting that the author, who had written it to specification, reduce it by about 50%. This Abbey proceeded to do. Another month passed before a different editor wrote to say that the article could not be printed owing to a lack of space. The Times never paid Abbey a kill fee or even bothered to return the manuscript to him. Later, he published it as Immigration and Liberal Taboos in a collection of his essays. One of its sentences asks, how many of us, truthfully, would prefer to be submerged in the Caribbean Latin version of civilization? The Times editors were not telling, but stories about the hazards of nuclear waste disposal, the horrors of air pollution in strip-mined hills, and the destruction of the Brazilian rainforests continued to make it into the Sunday editions of the paper, as did reports of famine in Chad and Ethiopia, almost monthly headcounts of the population of China. The few conservative writers who outspokenly oppose substantial immigration into the United States have long known better than to play the environmental card when making their bid to their fellow conservatives, all too many of whom equate conservatism with unrestrained capitalism, although 5 or 6 centuries of industrial capitalism have probably done more to destroy traditional and humane ways of life than a century and a half of militant Marxist-Leninism. On this subject, however, the time has arrived for plain speaking. The environmentalist argument, plus the cultural one, provides the essential overriding case against the waves of immigrants now cresting along the borders of the continental United States. Contrary to conservative opinion, America is not underpopulated, whatever that might mean. Advocates of immigration at present or elevated levels repeat ad nauseum that immigration is an American tradition. Well, so are spacious skies, amber waves of grain, wide open spaces, the open range, and the wilderness of mountain, desert, and plain. Can anyone really imagine America without them? Pause for reflection. Can anyone really imagine that America without another... Can anyone really imagine America without another 30 million Mexicans, 6 million more Iranians, 10 million additional people from the Caribbean, and 3 or 4 million fugitive refugees from the Soviet Union? I thought so. As for the environmentalists themselves, they need a little, much more than a little, of Abby's courage and forthrightness if they are going to hold their own and argue their cause successfully in the new America of diversity and multiculturalism that is surely coming, if the government in Washington does not catch up in a hurry with the opinion of a public that is already resentful and has been for years of the huddled masses arriving daily in this country. Does anyone believe for 1 minute that a United States in which European Americans are a minority and third world peoples a plurality will leave in place, let alone add to, the rather vast body of statutory law relating to environmental protection? The most polluted region of the United States lies along the 2,700-mile border it shares with Mexico. And Mexico itself, where everything from tamale wrappers to heavy industrial equipment, when finished with, is dispensed directly, immediately, and thoughtlessly into the environment, so beloved of American preservationists, is incomparably worse. The train lines and highways I have traveled in Mexico are cordona pas sanitaires of garbage, detritus, and junk. End quote. So he has a kind of, I will go ahead and say, I think, awkward writing style. Little interjections and rambling sentences. He's not my favorite writer in this book, but he's hitting some important points, I think, here, where he says that conservatives don't really want to bring the environmental aspect of this immigration question into the conversation, because too many conservatives just think that what conservatism really means is unfettered capitalism, and that's the beginning, the end, and the middle of what conservatism is. He says, never mind the fact that actually, a couple centuries of industrial capitalism has demolished our traditions, our ways of life, has totally transformed us into materialistic consumer societies. But let's not worry too much about that at the moment. He says the fact is, it's time to speak plainly. He says there are two arguments: the cultural argument, of course, but also the environmental argument needs to be deployed to make the case against the endless waves of immigrants. He says, actually, we like our open spaces. We like our open range, our wilderness, our deserts, our mountains. We like America as it is. It's not underpopulated. We don't need to bring in millions of additional people to fill up every nook and cranny. We're not trying to pack ourselves in here like sardines. There's no reason why we should try to maximize the number of people in this country. There's no reason why we need to do that. And the only people who seriously advocate that, unless they're just reciting things that they don't understand, are people who somehow stand to profit, or perhaps are just so ideologically committed to to a simplistic view of America as an economic zone that, if you double the population, then you double the GDP, and GDP goes up, and therefore, somehow we all win. I'm not sure what winning really means in such a scenario, but the point being that he says that the most polluted area is along the border of Mexico, and in Mexico, the pollution is insane. Everything is just discarded immediately, directly, and thoughtlessly into the environment. The tamale wrappers, industrial equipment, there's no concern in Mexico for the environment. It's just junk, just disposed of on the side of the highway. And you can look to the third world. You can look to nations in Africa. You can look to nations in Southeast Asia or South America or anywhere. And the peoples of these nations, they're not environmentally conscious. They're spewing out, pollutants into the atmosphere. They're putting all sorts of crap in their rivers. They're rivers of garbage in many of these places, just flowing with crap. Maybe it's biological, literally crap, or maybe more often just plastic junk flowing out into the ocean. And we have all these microplastics in the ocean and microplastics in our bodies. And we look at these rivers in the third world, it's just garbage flowing into the ocean. And, the environmentalists don't ever want to even think about or address this. They'll always scold us. They'll always scold us who have the most stringent environmentalist regulations. And he says, do we really think that when white Europeans become a minority and the third world immigrants become the majority, that we're going to maintain the sort of environmental regulations and environmental concerns that we currently have? It's not likely. And he does talk a little bit about Edward Abbey. I haven't read anything by Edward Abbey, but I think I do know who he is. I've encountered the name before, and this is a sort of anti-immigration environmentalist. Probably holds a basically centrist position of some sort, where he picks up a bit of the environmentalism and the nature-loving ways of the left, kind of an old hippie, but also recognizes some more right-wing ideas, particularly about immigration and tradition. Edward Abbey seems like a pretty interesting fellow, to be honest. I would not mind reading some works of his. I don't have anything by him, but I'll just add that to the massive pipeline of authors that I would like to read at some point. But anyway, I think that's interesting. The environmentalist argument can be sort of deployed in this battle against the endless flood of immigration. So in this same essay, Williamson talks a little bit more, a little bit later, about multiculturalism. And he says, quote, "If European America were presently a strong and healthy culture, willing to tolerate a liberal immigration policy and to welcome people of non-European stocks and cultures in a spirit of confident generosity and manly self-esteem, there would be something genuinely heroic, though still wrong-headed, in its determination to do so. In fact, we are no longer a young, powerful, restless, and inexhaustibly optimistic society, capable of surmounting great difficulties, and eager to accept all challenges, in particular idealistic ones. Today, we are a very different country than what we were in the 19th and early 20th centuries, middle-aged at least, perhaps prematurely old. We are no longer restless, we are bored and tentative. We are not optimistic, but increasingly, and with good reason, the opposite. We have lost confidence in our heritage, our traditions, and above all, perhaps, our faith. This does not mean that we will necessarily adopt other traditions and other faiths. It does mean that we will have less and less of ourselves to offer people, whom we would assimilate to the remnant of an indigenous culture. We know this, and so do the people who have recently appeared among us. The stranger is within the gates, and he smells blood. I do not mean that he is bloodthirsty. He simply senses our weakness, and is ready to exploit it as far as he can. He is taking advantage of us. And we cannot claim that we have not left ourselves open to and even encouraged him. Multiculturalism is a sign, maybe a proof of this. The multiculturalist standard is the direct result of the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, which, by removing the national quotas provision of earlier immigration legislation, cleared the way for great numbers of immigrants from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and other non-European regions of the world. It is also noticed served by these immigrants and by others on their behalf that assimilation is henceforth an outmoded concept, ethnocentric at best and racist at worst, and that this and future generations of newcomers will have no part in it, or of that Western civilization that is also under attack. And who, after all, is going to tell them differently? As the new immigrants arrive in their numbers in America, they will not only prove, in plain fact, unassimilable, they will be able, by the exercise of the suffrage, to alter American society to the extent that they will not need to assimilate to it. Perhaps there will be nothing left of the original to assimilate to. Already this is seen to be the strategy of the leading Hispanic rights organizations. While there has been talk in the Mexican-American community for at least 2 decades of using their numbers and their vote to effect the secession of several of the southwestern states, which would either be incorporated by Mexico or form the new nation of Aztlan. We have already experienced one episode of secession in our history. Stranger things have occurred than that it should happen again. Just look at Canada. There are further dangers inherent in multiculturalism beyond the foreseeable submergence of European American culture and governance in the United States. The situation that is likely to evolve is not so simple a one as us versus them, white versus brown, European versus non-European. Jesse Jackson to the contrary, there will be no rainbow coalition, or if there is, it will be of very limited duration. Underlying the cant, the yes-saying, the cultural politics, and the silly celebrations of unity, profound resentments and antagonisms exist in multi-ethnic America that will surely grow stronger and deeper with time, and with continuing immigration from every part of the world. Nearly 40 years after desegregation, and a quarter century after the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, relations between whites and blacks in this country are arguably worse than they have been at any time in our history. It is an open secret that blacks collectively despise Hispanics, again collectively, and vice versa, and that both groups are resentful and suspicious of Asians, who seem happy to return the compliment. Georgie Ann Geyer, the newspaper columnist, invited her readers to witness the disintegration of the Soviet Union and learn from it. The day of what she euphemistically terms the socially complicated state is over, she warned, or at least the writing is on the wall. Events throughout the world today have one great thing to tell us, namely, that everywhere blood is thicker than water. Modern nations that not only refuse to recognize this truth, but deliberately fly in the face of it, will do so at their peril. In the light of America's immigration problem, James Burnham's Suicide of the West takes on a newer meaning. From the time when the Puritans landed in Massachusetts, Americans have tended to think of themselves as members of a church whose reality has a secular dimension beyond the religious one. As the religious sensibility has waned in American society, the assurance of a quasi-religious mission has increased, to the point where the United States at the end of the 20th century seems to regard itself as a collective Christ figure, redeeming the world by example and by purity of intention. But if we do succeed in crucifying ourselves, after our crucifixion we shall not rise again. There will be no inheritors and apostles of our peculiar faith. The third world, its cultures, its peoples, will remain emphatically in place, but we ourselves will have perished forever, having accomplished by our suicide no good for anyone, save a relative handful of the world's refugees, and even those only in the short run. Because we have killed the goose that laid the golden eggs. The third world is its people, not its sinister, corrupt, greedy, and incompetent governments. Where the people are, there the third world is, and will be. We have no magical, alchemical atmosphere capable of imbuing third world peoples with the ability to maintain the first world culture that created and continues to create the economic and technical fruits for which they hunger. In the collapse of European America, nobody will be a winner, except for the chronically and pathologically resentful, from our own ranks as well as from those of our supplanters. And even theirs will be a Pyrrhic victory. Then America will correspond, at last and in reality, with the description falsely applied to it in the 1960s by Professor John Kenneth Galbraith of Harvard University, when he wrote that the United States was a land of private affluence surrounded by public squalor. It will, in other words, truly have become another third world country. End quote. Okay, a long section there, almost 3 pages, but a couple of important points. Working from the beginning, he basically says, if we were like strong and healthy culture, if we were confident culture, and we felt that we could through the power of our culture assimilate these other peoples, there would perhaps be something heroic, but it would still be stupid. But perhaps there'd be something heroic about the notion. But we're not this young, strong, healthy, vibrant society, willing and able to adopt and assimilate others into our great culture. We're old. Our culture is old. We're not really, America's not an old nation, but he says perhaps we're prematurely old because our culture acts like it's old. We've given up on ourselves, and we don't love ourselves. We don't care about ourselves. We just ruminate about all the things we've done wrong, and if we could do it all over, we'd do it differently. We're not a vibrant culture, at least, when he's writing this. And this essay was, let me just double check, this essay was written in 1991. So, a lot of us nowadays think of the 80s as this like vibrant time, but there was some of that in the 80s, of course, sort of youthfulness, but there was also the same sort of tiredness in Western culture back then. But the point here is that the people who have arrived know this as well. He says, we will have less and less of ourselves to offer people whom we would assimilate. He says, we know that we don't have the capacity to assimilate people into our culture because we don't even believe in our culture. He says, we know this, and so do they. He says, the strangers within the gates, and he smells blood. They know that we can be taken advantage of. The stranger, the foreigner, senses our weakness and is ready to exploit it. And we've left ourselves open to this exploitation. And he mentions the Immigration Reform Act of 65, so that we don't import people. As a Western nation, we used to import people from other Western nations. Good fit. Now we import the third world. The numbers go up, and the type of people we bring in has changed. We bring in people from all sorts of other cultures, other civilizations, not just other nations, but other civilizations, and other civilizations that are, in some cases, hostile to us. He says that there are Hispanic groups. This is, back in the 80s and 1991, this is published. And back then, and the same today, these organizations of Hispanic rights groups, La Raza, they want California and the states along the Rio Grande to split off from the United States and rejoin Mexico or form another nation entirely. They're not here to assimilate. Some are, of course. It's blanket statements, but many of them are not. They don't wave our flag. They wave the flag of their homeland, which is where they come from and which is where their allegiance truly lies. And he also says it's not just going to be this sort of us versus them, European, non-European. There's not going to be a rainbow coalition. There's a ton of different groups. It's going to be balkanization. It's going to be group against group, race against race, ethnicity against ethnicity, religion against religion, cities versus urbans, total conflict along every axis as our nation begins to disintegrate. We're not going to hold together. as the groups that loathe the United States of America increase in power, as our nation fragments with all these competing interest groups, it's just going to kind of dissolve and disintegrate if we don't do something to change the way things are going. And he says, events everywhere throughout the world have one great thing to tell us, that blood is thicker than water. And what he means by this, of course, is that we're not going to be able to hold ourselves together through ideas, through papers, through laws, through institutions. Blood is thicker than water, and our loyalties, well, with the odd, unusual, weird exception of many modern European Americans who don't seem to recognize this basic fact. But for many people who have been brought up in foreign cultures where this is more obvious, blood is thicker than water, and their allegiance is to their kin. And that's a recipe for disaster. And interestingly, he says that United States at the end of the 20th century regards itself as a collective Christ figure, redeeming the world by example, but we're crucifying ourselves, trying to be the Christ of the world, that everybody else in the world is going to be awed by our selflessness. We're just going to set ourselves up and sacrifice ourselves for our ideals, sacrifice our nation, sacrifice the integrity of our future, sacrifice our ethnic groups in pursuit of these higher ideals, that somehow we're going to convince the world of our greatness through our own self-loathing. It's a strange self-sacrifice, the suicide of the West, that we are intending to accomplish, but it's not ever going to work because he says the third world is its people. When you bring the third world here, the third worlders don't become first worlders, but our nation becomes the third world. And I'm sure we are seeing that and will continue to see that. So let's move forward to another essay called Conspicuous Benevolence by Garrett Hardin, and he talks a little bit more about population. He says, quote, "The one certain thing about population control is that we do not yet know how to achieve it. That needs a bit of explaining. If human beings do absolutely nothing about controlling their populations, nature will do it for us, because the world, our world, is limited. Sure, a few human beings might eventually be shipped off to the stars in a spaceship, but this could never be a feasible way in which to deal with unhindered population growth. At the present time, world population is increasing by 250,000 people per day. At a cost of tens of millions of dollars per astral passenger, we will never be rich enough to solve the population problem that way. Never mind, nature will solve the problem for us. The high death rate in countries like Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh will, if we sit on our hands, ultimately be great enough to produce zero population growth, ZPG. At present, all that nature is producing is misery. Bangladesh, with an area the size of Iowa, has a population 38 times as great, and each year it adds another Iowa's worth of population. As miserable as conditions are in Bangladesh now, they are slated to become worse before ZPG sets in. That is not the kind of population control we are looking for. Some of the European models appeal to us more. From time to time, one country or another has been in the ZPG mode. For a few years, Hungary, East Germany, and recently apparently Italy. How did they manage to do this? Not by government fiat. The unsought answer was a housing shortage. A newly married couple moving into a tiny apartment with his or her parents was told in no uncertain terms, "No babies." By the time they could get an apartment of their own, the most fertile years of married life were past. A housing shortage is a great contraceptive in Europe, but not, obviously, in most tropical countries, whatever the reason. In times past, nature enforced ZPG in another way, through crowd diseases, the mortality rate of which rises with increased housing. Tuberculosis, typhus, and the dysenteries are good examples. Until about 3 centuries ago, overpopulation was corrected spasmodically by one disease or another sweeping through a region. In the Great Plague of the mid-14th century, a quarter of Europe's population is estimated to have died in 2 years. Then came agricultural improvements, the sanitation movement, and Pasteurian modern medicine. The corrective feedback of disease seemed to come to an end. Will AIDS move us back to an earlier era where fate was in charge? We do not know. Certainly AIDS is a lousy disease. The amount of suffering caused per human death is horrible. Not like cholera, for instance, where most of the victims died in 2 days' time. Rather simple measures, treating cholera patients like heat stroke victims, can reduce the mortality from 95% to less than 5%. If the disease AIDS is nature's new control for population growth, we have much to complain about. We want something gentler than disease as a controller of population. But what? To date, we have been unable to agree on a substitute. We hope to find some sort of community control of the fertility of individual parents. That is a tough problem for people brought up in the European tradition of individual freedom. We have not found the answer. We can make progress if we settle for less than a total answer. We should try the incremental approach, adopting partial measures that will slow the population growth, giving us more time to look for more general solutions. In dealing with population growth, it is a blessing that the world is divided into nearly 200 nations. Different nations can try different experiments. By observing the success or failure of other nations, we may be able to come up with a model that works for us. If there were only one sovereignty, one world, then only one experiment could be tried at a time. Given our great ignorance, that would be a frightening gamble. In population experiments, it is important that each nation experiment only with itself, so it can speedily observe whether an experiment is successful or not. For rich nations like ours, the most feasible partial solution is an immediate restriction of immigration. At the present time, immigration accounts for roughly 50% of our population growth. So the potential for progress in population control is great if we do nothing more than see to it that the rate of immigration is no greater than the rate of emigration. Actually, even though such a policy would be aimed only at improving our own situation, it would indirectly help other nations control their populations too. No nation that can foist off its extra people onto other nations is likely to take its population problem seriously. Consider how Castro evaded Cuba's population problem when Jimmy Carter was president. The Marielitos, the boat people he shoved off onto the United States, totaled some 130,000, which was just 1 year's population increase for Cuba. Fortunately, our administration soon showed a rare display of courage and indicated no more. The Cubans have not, of course, found a solution to their population problem yet, but maybe they will someday if we and others refuse to accept their surplus. End quote. Okay, so most of that section's not really about immigration so much. He talks about it at the end, how there are a whole slew of nations, and different nations can try to deal with their population growth in their own manner and can look to other nations to see what works and what doesn't work. And he says that, at least for the United States of America, one quick, easy way to control population growth would be to cut net immigration to zero. In other words, the amount coming in is no greater than the amount going out. And that would eliminate a huge portion of population growth in America and in the Western world. Now, again, this article, let me check the date of this. It sounds dated when you hear it or when you read it, that nobody talks like this anymore about population. So yeah, this is 1991. So nobody talks anymore about population explosion in the United States or in the Western world, because populations really aren't exploding. The United States population is increasing, I believe, but it's not increasing at a ridiculously dramatic rate. And certainly all, not just 50%, but I would say all of our population growth, to what population growth there is or there may be in the United States and particularly elsewhere in the Western world, essentially all population growth in the Western world is on account of immigration. That's it. If it wasn't for immigration, we'd be looking at population stability, zero population growth, he calls ZPG, back when this was a common enough topic that it had its own acronyms. Zero population growth, ZPG, we're there. If we get rid of our immigration, we're probably actually at negative population growth. Now, negative population growth, as I said earlier, is something that the technocrats, Elon Musk and others, among the conservatives, think is a catastrophic circumstance, negative population growth, to have a country with a declining population. Now, there are certainly problems that go along with that. It's not to say that it's just a simple issue of no problem. There's problems with ballooning population, and there's problems with declining population. Neither of those are just simple fixes to make our lives better. Declining population can be a problem because there are a number of things going on simultaneously. The lifespan is extending. People are living longer. And so you get to a scenario where someone will maybe work for 40 years of their life and then retire for another 40 years. So their retirement lifespan is just as long as the amount of time they spent working. And they're going to have, those old people are going to have to be supported somehow. And unless they're literally saving 50% of their money to pay for their life during retirement, they're going to have problems. So, this is the Social Security sort of pyramid scheme, and it becomes the greater the demand of the retirees, the more of a real pyramid scheme it becomes, where money is extracted from the working youth through taxes to pay for the retirements of people who, through whatever reason, necessity or irresponsibility, didn't save adequately, weren't able to save adequately to pay for their life through this extended retirement. And you look at a birth rate crisis. So fewer people being born over an extended period of time, fewer young people, and more old people, with greater and greater tax demand on the population in order to keep them alive, and more advanced medical techniques to keep them alive. And so as more medical techniques become available, those all have to get paid for. So the medical expenses of the elderly go up. The pharmaceutical companies and the healthcare industry find more and more ways to extract money from the retirees to keep them alive for longer and longer, and all this stuff has to get paid for. So the idea is essentially that negative population growth can have its own problems when paired with extended lifespans, low fertility rates. This is potentially problematic, but it's not the case that we live in a world where population can just increase endlessly. Once upon a time, nature had its own ways of achieving zero population growth, and often this was through disease. And diseases, they spread in high concentration areas, cities where there are lots of people clustered together, spreading their germs with one another. So as the population gets higher, diseases sweep through, and whether it may in some cases be simple lack of resources to feed the ever increasing population that would act as a check. There were certain things that nature would provide as a check against ballooning population. And I guess we've just decided that the best check against ballooning population is to simply fail to procreate. That's what we've decided our solution is, and we achieve this through pretty much every single liberal agenda item is in some way aiming at reducing procreation, whether it's abortion or homosexuality or feminism or whatever. Every aspect of the modern left, if you look at it closely, ultimately revolves around not procreating. Whereas every other culture in the world that hasn't adopted the suicidal leftist ideology is continuing to procreate and intends to replace the stupid liberal West. So, like I said, some of it sounds a little dated. We don't really worry about overpopulation in the Western world, but I guess my point is we should remain concerned about overpopulation in other parts of the world when we provide resources, foreign aid, food resources, other sorts of resources, medical resources, to the third world that all facilitate expanded population. So the liberal agenda, when applied to the Western world, always points toward fewer children. And oddly, the liberal agenda, when applied to how we interact with the third world, always seems to point toward more children. The infant mortality rate in the third world goes down. Lifespans in the third world go up. And in the West, we've sort of paired the advanced medicine and the lowered infant mortality. We've paired with lowering birth rates, having fewer children. If more children make it to adulthood, and if you want to have a stable population number, then you would have to pair the lowering infant mortality, the increased lifespans. You'd have to pair that with a shrinking birth rate. Those two things would have to go hand in hand. But the third world's birth rate is not shrinking because the third world is not adopting liberalism. Liberalism is something that we apply to ourselves, progressivism. We apply it to ourselves. We don't apply it to the rest of the world. Our job is to facilitate population explosion in the third world and population decimation in the West. That is the end goal of liberalism in a nutshell. So anyway, last section, same essay, talking a bit about globalism. He says, quote, "Controlling immigration means controlling borders. To judge from most stories in the newspapers and on television, this would seem to be so repugnant a measure that most Americans would reject it. I challenge this assumption. For some 10 years, opinion surveys have shown that a large majority, typically 80% or more, of Americans favor reducing immigration. Why then do the media put a contrary spin on their stories of immigration and immigrants? The nation is schizoid about population. Explaining the discrepancy requires an approach that is almost psychoanalytical. To begin with, there is the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, etc. We are a nation of immigrants, we say. But so is every nation. Our trouble is that we recently grew by immigration. We have not yet realized that childhood cannot last forever. Then there is that glorious banner, one world. Most people assume this means one world without borders. But it should be noted that the United Nations Charter, a quintessentially idealistic document, asserts the right of emigration but not the right of immigration. To claim the latter would, after all, be to assert a right to invade. One-worlders are not willing to go that far. Arguments for unrestricted immigration have ancient roots in religion and philosophy. "I am a citizen of the world," said Zeno of Citium in the 3rd century BC. And the Bible frequently praises universal brotherhood. Opposed to the seductive calls for cosmopolitanism and universal brotherhood have been the equally powerful tribalistic tendencies of mankind. To some extent, people have divided into two camps on the issues of borders and loyalty. Broadly speaking, practical men have favored the limited loyalties of family, tribe, and nation. Universal loyalty has been more enthusiastically promoted by those who are somewhat alienated from the rank and file, by religious prophets and secular scholars. In generating persuasive rhetoric, the one-worlders have been clear winners over those who would restrict immigration. It is painful to be abused by the emotion-laden terms prejudice, bigotry, parochialism, xenophobia, racism, chauvinism, intolerance, and provincialism. Those who wish to eradicate restrictionist national loyalties have been greatly helped by two images. The first is that of Spaceship Earth, based on the great NASA photographs of Earth from space. The second is the heartwarming rhetorical image of Marshall McLuhan's Global Village. In the middle of the 20th century, new strength was given to the universalist argument by the threat of atomic bombs. It seemed quite possible that all-out nuclear warfare might extinguish civilization, perhaps even the whole human species. It was argued that since it was the persistence of nation-states that made the bomb so dangerous, we must get rid of nations and create a single world sovereignty. The proposal is tempting, but Bertrand Russell pointed out its fatal weakness in 1948. A world state, if it were firmly established, would have no enemies to fear, and would therefore be in danger of breaking down through lack of cohesive force. Many of Russell's readers felt that for once Bertie spoke with too much restraint. A single world state would be more than merely in danger of breaking down. It would be certain to shatter. Driven by the twin engines of self-interest and a craving for friends and allies, an atomized society would be certain to crystallize around new centers, new cliques, new tribes. New loyalties would generate new conflicts. End quote. So there you have a bit about globalism, and of course a few sections there that I want to draw attention to. The first, and I think most important, is that opinion surveys have shown that a large majority, typically 80% or more, of Americans favor reducing immigration. So, for a long time, up to the present, although I think it might be a little bit less than 80% today because of the overwhelming success of left-wing brainwashing in the school system and elsewhere. Nevertheless, for many decades, Americans and people throughout the Western world did not want endless immigration. They did not prefer it. Surveys indicated that they wanted less immigration. But the media pushes a different story. The media constantly pushes the notion that we should be aiming to eliminate borders. We should not be trying to control our borders, but we should throw our borders wide open. More immigration is always better. Why? Why is it that the media and the politicians continue to push this? Why is it that academia continues to push it? He's got a couple of ideas here. First of all, the good old Statue of Liberty with its little poem, "Give me your tired, your poor." That's not in the Constitution, by the way. It's not in the Declaration of Independence. We didn't choose that for ourselves. It was a gift from France. France apparently decides our immigration policy. And, of course, the idea of one world. And what's remarkable is he says that we should remember that the United Nations does not assert a right to immigrate to a country. It asserts the right to emigrate. In other words, the United Nations asserts that if you want to leave your country, you should be able to leave. Your country, your nation should not lock you in, should not prevent you from escaping. If you want to leave, you should be allowed to leave. But what the United Nations does not assert is that you have a right to enter a country. Another country would have to let you in. You don't, just because you have a right to leave your country doesn't mean that any other country is obligated to let you in. They may let you in, but you don't have a right to go there without their permission. They have to say, okay, you can come in. They have to open the door and let you in. You don't have a right to just go there. He says that would essentially be a right to invade. That would be equivalent to the right to invade. He says the one-worlders won't go that far. But nowadays, the one-worlders do go that far, and they do assert a right to immigrate. That everyone on the world, on the whole planet, has the right to come here. Has the right to immigrate to the United States of America. We don't have the right to tell them no. That's what people say nowadays, and it's kind of insane, but that's where we are. And the other thing that I think is interesting is he says that this one world philosophy goes back, it has its roots in religion and philosophy. He mentions Zeno, who I believe was a Stoic, talking about being a citizen of the world, and he talks about how the Bible praises universal brotherhood. So religion and philosophy have, not all philosophy, of course, but some strains of philosophy, and certainly present in religion, Christian religion, distinctly more so than, say, ethnic tribalism or ethnic paganism. Didn't quite make the same assertions, but the Bible talks about universal brotherhood. He says people are divided into two camps on these issues. And he says that, broadly speaking, practical men have favored limited loyalties of family, tribe, and nation. Universal loyalty has been more enthusiastically promoted by people who are alienated from the rank and file, religious prophets, secular scholars, so kind of outcasts from their society. People who are misfits have been advocating for a long time in favor of the universal brotherhood of mankind, loyalty to the planet, loyalty to humanity, and not the particular limited loyalties of practical men to their families, their communities, their nations, their tribes. And it seems as though it's more of like the natural default state of man to, and I talked about this in many other books, including the Rule of the Clan was the one that jumps out, but we're basically by nature sort of tribal. We have a natural allegiance to our families and to our communities and to our kin. This is hardwired into us. And it takes a devotion to religion or a devotion to philosophy and essentially a devotion to abstract ideals that we adopt and superimpose onto ourselves to dominate our natural instincts, right? I mean, religion is sort of a method of engaging in war with your natural instincts. At least many religions. Not all religions, let's say. Not all possible religions. It's at least conceivable for religion of some sort to conform with human nature. But in general, the religions that we have had on this planet have been religions that are opposed to our natures. They demand something different from us from what we would naturally be inclined to do. And in that way, they are idealistic, and they are not practical, they are not common sense, they're not the things that come naturally to us, It's an external control of our natural instincts, and that's where the desire for globalism and universality and universal brotherhood and things like that all seem to come from. So I thought that was pretty interesting. This has not been something no one has spoken about, no one has thought about. There have been people who have spoken about it and thought about it, and those people have been ignored. This isn't a secret. The catastrophic effects of immigration isn't a secret. It isn't something we just figured out. People, conservatives, particularly paleo-conservatives, have been raising the alarm and have been ignored. Actually, before I go, one last thing that I thought was interesting about this book is that the governor of California at the time, Pete Wilson, contributed an essay to Chronicles magazine talking about the problems of immigration in California. And the governor of California says in his essay that like 2/3 of the babies born in LA hospitals are born to illegal immigrants. This is back in like 95. 93 maybe. And then after writing this article, easily won re-election. There was a pushback even in California against this. People could see it happening. And the governor called it out, and the people still voted for him. They supported him. They supported a restrictionist governor. And the idea that any California governor could ever say anything against immigration and still win an election nowadays, I mean, how far have we fallen? And I'll just say thank the gods for Donald Trump. And I will talk to you again next time.